Thank you, Bob, and welcome. The Global Philanthropy Forum did indeed start as a partnership among 4 institutions, but now it is an ever-growing network of which you are truly an essential part. So we thank you for being with us today and tomorrow, and ask that you help lead this conversation as we work through some of the world's toughest problems. The speakers are going to set the stage, they're going to frame the issues, and they're going to serve as resources to you, but you're the experts. We're going to ask that you use this time together to share best practices, strategies that have worked, to tell stories that will help benefit your colleagues as they do their work. Now, we're mindful of the crisis that exists in Central and South Asia, where the fighting continues. And so we're going to examine the needs of that region, but we ask that you consider ways in which the conditions there obtain elsewhere in the world. For sadly, Afghanistan is not the only society to crumble, nor is it the only state to fail. As we work through the agenda, a subtext will emerge, a set of propositions, if you will, to be tested. The first such proposition is that the best antidote to a highly networked transnational criminal society like Al-Qaeda just may be an equally resourceful and equally sophisticated networked civil society comprised of people who are committed to positive change. The second proposition is that there may be other, in fact, there are other Afghanistans in the making, in Latin America, in Africa, Asia, throughout the world. Some may even be a part of the coalition on terror on which we're currently relying. Third, the problems faced in the region are interconnected. While we may not know the exact causal relationships among such stresses as endemic poverty, overpopulation, resource scarcity, infectious diseases, political corruption, political repression, these problems tend to coincide. They're symptoms of a syndrome that cause societies to become unglued. The fourth proposition that we face is that the problems that societies are wrestling with are not bounded by place, they're not bounded by geography, they're transnational in nature, and they require a collaborative response. The fifth proposition is that collaboration is the name of the day. Innovative partnerships are being formed, not only across borders, but across sectors. Ask Tayu of Cisco about that company's collaboration with the government of Jordan and with the United Nations. Ask Charlie McCormack of Save the Children about collaborations that NetAid, I note that Lorene Listwin, Don Listwin are here, that NetAid and others have had with the UN Development Program and individual donors and NGOs like SAVE and CARE. The sixth proposition is that while social change is a collective enterprise, it is a collaborative venture, there's nothing more powerful than a single courageous individual. New leaders are emerging every day from unexpected places in unanticipated ways, and many of them are among you today. We ask that you get to know them. People have traveled from as far as Uzbekistan to be with us. Participate. They will be speakers this afternoon. Participate in their sessions. Get to know them, celebrate them, marvel at what they do. The seventh proposition is that strategic philanthropy works. But it's not about safe bets, and it's not about quick returns. You'll hear some stunning success stories about diseases eradicated, arsenals dismantled, violent conflicts averted. But getting there took taking risks, and in no case were the results rapid. Sometimes the results were years in the making. The rewards are not immediate. Having said the rewards are not immediate, there is a reward at the end of this particular rainbow, at the end of this conference, something that is not in your printed program. Paul Hawken took a look at the work we're doing over the day and a half before us and thought, gosh, you're working people awfully hard. I think there ought to be a present, a thank you gift. And that thank you gift is Sebastian Salgado, who is flying from Brazil to join us. He will share with us his photographs, which are powerful, which are stunning, and which will remind us of the importance of the work that you do. Now it's my pleasure to announce this first panel. We're starting off the day with three extraordinary individuals who have made a decided difference and continue to do so. We've asked that they use Central and South Asia as their starting point, but each of these leaders thinks globally, they act strategically, their vision is large, so don't expect them to limit their scope. Kavita Ramdas is President and CEO of Global Fund for Women. She will speak to the ways in which September 11 and its aftermath have shaped the philanthropic agenda. Mark Malloch Brown is Administrator of the UN Development Program. He will speak to the international community's commitment to rebuilding Afghanistan and to broader efforts for development. Gordon Conway is known for his efforts to advance food security. He is now President of Rockefeller Foundation, and he will speak to the need to pursue an integrated strategy for human security and environmental sustainability and improved quality of life. So please join me in welcoming our panel and in welcoming Kavita.
Good morning. It's a great honor for me to be here this morning. I was asked to speak about the new urgency. And in some senses, I think there isn't a single one of us in this room, or perhaps anywhere else in the world, that doesn't feel a different and a serious and a changed sense of urgency since those terrible events of September 11th and the many terrible events that succeeded those very first ones. This sense of urgency comes from deep places both within us as human beings who live in a world that is increasingly one. It also comes from our sense of being people who have been privileged to live in this country. And I think perhaps nowhere were we as shaken as those of us who lived in this country, in the United States, by the events of September 11th. In some profound way, those events for the United States shook this country's sense of security and shook its sense of exceptionalism. In my comments, I want to talk a little bit about what this new urgency offers us as an opportunity, what it presents as a challenge for those of us who are privileged to work in this field called philanthropy, and what vision of a different world we have to look forward to if we're willing to take that challenge and engage in the risks that Jane spoke about. In some ways, you could say this is a story about an open door, about canaries, and about the light at the end of a tunnel. What do I mean when I say the events of September 11th shook this country and its sense of security and exceptionalism? What I mean is that for a variety of reasons, the events of September 11th made the United States and all of us who are privileged to live in this country, no matter where we come from, made us realize that we are deeply and essentially a part of the whole, and that we can no longer work and operate in ways that separate us from the rest of the world. That's the open door. In some sense, those opportunities give us a chance to respond. And the chance to respond either means that we are willing to take the opportunity, step up to it, engage with it, become truly a part of the rest of the world, or it can make us afraid, timid, reactive, and lead us to seek to reassert a sense of exceptionalism and uniqueness and separateness. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the current administration has chosen the latter route. By doing so, we have failed, I think. By doing so, this administration has failed to think about the opportunities presented to us to engage with another way of looking at the world. And this is the challenge to us, those of us who are citizens, those of us who are part of civil society, those of us who are privileged to be a part of philanthropy. This is why it is so urgent for us to think differently. There is, at the same time as there are forces that exert this kind of separateness, and in a strange way there is a bizarre symmetry between the forces, whether they are Hindu fundamentalists in India or Muslim fundamentalists in Afghanistan or Christian fundamentalists in this country or anywhere else in the world. This sense of uniqueness, that we are separate, we have an identity that is different, superior, better, other than the rest of the world, separates us and removes the opportunity for us to work together. And yet, in the last 15 years, 20 years, there has been an extraordinary flowering of civil society in places all around the world, places that have known terror, places that have known war, places that have known conflict. You can count them: Rwanda, Lebanon, Kosovo. The list goes on and on. The challenge for global philanthropy, I believe, is that we have a chance to strengthen those voices. We have a chance to strengthen the voices that are talking about one world, that are talking about a shared experience, that are talking about ways that are different than engaging with violence. And we need to be willing to make a strong intervention in this regard. We have very little time to do this. If you look at what's happening with the Hindu-Muslim riots in India today, if you look at the terrible experience of the kidnapping of Daniel Pearl, if you look at 100 other examples, if you look at the bombs that continue to drop on people in Afghanistan and other parts of the world, the most recognizable language right now in the world is one of violence. And the voices that are calling for a different way of doing things are remaining relatively unheard and unheeded. That is our challenge. That is the urgency. Among these voices, perhaps the strongest and the most articulate and the most clear in terms of an option for change are the voices of women. And we at the Global Fund for Women heard this very clearly from women's organizations from all around the world after September 11th, calling out for a way in which to make a difference. Global philanthropy is a way to make that difference. And I think the opportunity to make grants be a medium for change through engaging with some of the most extraordinary social movements of our time is an opportunity that we cannot afford to let go at this moment. The canaries. Why do I refer to canaries in this story? To me, in many, many countries around the world, and Afghanistan was only one of them, the status of women, the situation that they find themselves in, the lack of opportunities that are available to women and girls, are a sure and clear indicator of other values in those societies, of the ability of those societies to actually address some of the underlying questions and dilemmas. And we have extraordinary opportunity because women have taken such extraordinary leadership to be able to present an alternative vision of what this world might look like. I look around in this room and I see Sakina Yaqubi from the Afghan Institute for Learning, who I met in 1995, and who the Global Fund for Women supported with a small grant to do her work, supporting women's organizations inside Pakistan and inside Afghanistan when nobody knew where Afghanistan was on a map. I look in front of me and I see Indira Jaina, who started a women's fund in India a few years ago, when nobody thought it was possible for a poor country to also be a philanthropic strength. And I think about the opportunities to engage with women, with leaders like this, and I hope that we will see this as not just a strategy that has a moral imperative, but as a strategy that has extraordinary rewards and returns. And I don't need to quote you Lawrence Summers from the World Bank, or Muhammad Yunus from the Grameen Bank, or any other bankers for that matter, to be able to give you a sense of what those returns are. At the Global Fund for Women, we've learned that whether it is women fighting for peace, waging peace, as it were, in Israel, who've continued a dialogue between Palestinian and Israeli women's organizations through even this most difficult time, or whether it is supporting the Women's Coalition in Ireland that used opportunities to build bridges across the two warring sides, that there is possibility for change. This is the possibility I hope that I can leave you with. This is the possibility that I hope that this conference will lead us towards. I think that there are extraordinary opportunities here to think about philanthropy in a fundamentally different way, not as a privilege for those of us who are either fortunate to live in the most wealthy country in the world or to be wealthy in the most wealthy country in the world, but as a possibility for each one of us to engage in social change, as did Oral Atianazova, who is also here with us and who you will hear from in a few minutes, who turned around and became a donor to the Global Fund for Women after she received an award from the Goldman Foundation, making a $5,000 grant back to the Global Fund for Women to invest in other orals in other parts of the world. Philanthropy is not something that is unique to the position of being wealthy or privileged. It is an opportunity for each of us to make a difference. In the 14 years that I've been privileged to work in the field of philanthropy, I have never felt that there has been a more critical need and a more unique opportunity as the current moment. And I know from the personal experience of my work at the Global Fund and my work prior to that, that it is possible to use these resources with courage, with conviction, and with commitment. I hope very much that each of you will leave this conference with that same sense of possibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kavita Ramdas. We will now hear from Mark Malloch Brown, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program.
Thank you very much, Jane and Bob. And if I could acknowledge my very distinguished predecessor but one, Bill Draper, as Administrator of UNDP. There's lots of different ways of clustering countries in the world, and we tend to think north-south or east-west. As someone who spent my whole life in development in different ways in international affairs, I've always had a different classification, which is big countries versus the rest of us. And I've always been struck how China, India, Brazil and the United States have shared a particular characteristic which comes from sheer size, a sense that they can hold the rest of the world at bay. Now, I don't say that in any way in a critical sense, but it just shapes and influences politics in all four countries. However much each trades with the world, there is a sense of self-sufficiency which comes from the size and the self-sufficiency indeed of the economy and of the society. For America, that ended on September the 11th. In a sense, a strain of American history which goes back through several centuries of being able to engage in the two great world wars on its terms and at its own timing ended dramatically. The sense that you are part of one world, and in that way I think that an unfreezing of attitudes towards international affairs and international development is occurring in the country. And I say it as one who, as a European, saw even before September the 11th that as the problems of the extreme inequality in the global economy started to wash onto the shores of Europe, public health issues which could not be contained in their country of origin, drugs and narcotics issues, the opium from Afghanistan, which was ending up on the streets of Europe as heroin, the waves of migrants leaving their countries in destitution and crossing the porous borders of Europe. These issues had already in Europe led us to a new period, of the beginnings of a new period of international engagement, despite all the constraints of public spending and budget deficits and a global economy which has not been healthy in the last year or so. And it also led to a huge surge in private interest. Read a newspaper in Britain or Scandinavia, but also in France or Italy today, and you'll see much more coverage of development issues than you would have seen 5 or 10 years ago. Now, all of that, of course, is that energy in both the United States and Europe is for now focused on Afghanistan, the apparent source of the terrible events in September. And as we've seen, it's not over by any means, as the battles rage as we speak. But let me say that, as the one asked to take charge on the UN side of the early coordination of the outside support to the reconstruction of Afghanistan, that in a sense I would suggest to you that as people interested in supporting this, there are perhaps 4 critical levers to look at, which are the potential changes in that war-torn society. And all of them, you have to put them against a caution that until the events of September and the coalition campaign that began on October the 7th, this was a country which had had 23 years of war, where the people now in power in Kabul, as a result of the coalition campaign, had been pushed back into less than 5% of the country, and many of them in fact were in exile. But the previous government, the Taliban government, while it had essentially won militarily, was completely unable to consolidate anything approximating a nation state in the country. This was a country where the social and political cohesion was completely broken down. And we need to bear that in mind, because there's a little bit of an assumption that Western resources and commitment can somehow create a Switzerland in the Hindu-Kush overnight. It can't, as events are already clearly demonstrating. But I think there are 4 levers of change that we can very helpfully focus on, and the first is the role of women. To me, going to Kabul, which had a feel of Paris 1944 to it at the end of last year, a real sense of liberation, no sense at all of the American bombing having been anything but a force for good for most ordinary Afghans. People coming out of their houses, throwing back their burqas, you've seen it on television, and women, extraordinary women of the character and what they've been put through etched across their faces, but so many of them professional women who've been working with us, UNDP, and the other UN funds and programs for years, finally being able to congregate together again. We'd had to work with them singly because they were not allowed to associate with each other in Kabul. And this sense of that energy waiting to be engaged to drive the country towards a more tolerant, liberal, secular future. Yet at the same time, outside Kabul, extraordinary forces of conservatism, the same forces that created the Taliban in the first place. They're not gone. This is a society divided between town and country in a way that Cambodia was, in a way that Sierra Leone or Liberia are. This has got huge tensions between a conservative, poor, rural countryside and a more secular, middle-class city. And we have seen that explode all over the world into some of the nastiest genocidal contagions ever, and we shouldn't assume those dynamics are gone, and we have to work with them. The second issue is a much less easy one in a way to talk about, because to foundations wanting to really deal with a agenda of hope, to tell you that perhaps even before women, if I was honest about priorities, the issue of security comes first. This is a country where every Afghan tells you security, security, security. The need to face down the warlords through an expansion of the current international security force in Kabul to the rest of the country, but more critically, a need to build up a national police force and a national army. Not easy issues, but ones that we in UNDP feel we have to take on because of this this sense that if you don't build a national police force, there is never the stability in which the issues of the rights of women and other things of this kind can be addressed. But behind a police force lies a functioning, credible justice system, a system of transitional justice that address the crimes of the past, a rule of law that has the respect for all. So it's a huge, complex, interrelated sets of issues which then feed into the broader crisis of governance. This is a country with no revenue stream, with minimum administrative structures. Indeed, today, UNDP is paying the country's salaries of the civil service. And let me tell you, we're not doing them by bank transfer. Certainly not to individuals, but not even to the country. We're taking salaries in safe boxes under heavy security and distributing to the policemen, the civil service of the country in the most basic way possible, counting out $30 to each of them. And it is from that kind of beginning that we have to build a state which all Afghans feel they have trust in. And it brings me to the third issue, the third lever, youth. This, like so much of Asia, is a young country. Half the population is under 20 in a country where the civil war is more than 20 years old. So half the country has never known a central government which delivers benefits to them in the terms of education, healthcare, justice, stability. This is a half of a country which has grown up understanding that power came from the gun, because after all it's a society where a disproportionate, in fact half the country also carries a gun. So half of my 20-year-olds and under are themselves carrying guns. So to bring that demographic group back into civil society in the other sense of that term is a huge challenge. A generation that has missed out on education, a generation which, as I say, has been schooled and socialized in a society of violence without a state. Therefore, we've put huge priority on schooling and getting kids in school in time for the new school year that begins in March. The fourth issue, let me just hit it, is narcotics. We last week got the results of our aerial surveys of poppy cultivation, and after the last year of the Taliban government, where there's authoritarian governments are quite good at one thing, they stop drug cultivation when they want to, and so we had almost zero cultivation last year. This year, in the breakdown of Taliban order which occurred in the last quarter of the year, we now look as though we will have something like 2,500 metric tons of processed heroin potentially on the streets of Europe and Central Asia from this year's supply. So while it's half of the peak year of '99, the drug problem is back. And so struggling with those four those four levers seems to me, critical to whether we succeed in the country. But I want to take the last minutes I have to go beyond Afghanistan, to argue that in a way, for philanthropists like yourselves, dealing with a failed state is important, but it's after the event. It's coming in when, if you like, the damage is already done. That your most strategic interventions should be in failing states. And I want to tell you there are a lot of them. The demographic circumstance of Afghanistan, that huge youth population I mentioned, who's been failed by an education system. Where there is an education, it has tended to come from religious schools and not from mainstream secular education. That situation is replicated on a much vaster scale, from Iran through Pakistan. We have countries generating more than 1 million graduates a year in the 18-year-old approximate age range, coming out with inadequate education, with access to too few jobs, and with political systems which are inadequate to give them any kind of political voice or expression of their anger and frustration at this vicious circle of economic failure and the failure of educational provision, which is the circumstances they find themselves in. It stretches beyond Iran to Egypt and into West Africa. We face a huge demographic and a huge crisis of values, that we have literally billions of people being left out of the great global opportunity that has touched the lives of so many in North and South alike at the moment, but who are kept out by absence of education, absence of reformed economies in the societies in which they live, and ultimately kept out by their failure to embrace a value system that comes from the prosperity and jobs and education which we and so many others in the world today enjoy. We are developing a two-class world at an extraordinarily dangerous moment, because it's at the same moment that we've developed a borderless world. And the consequences, I think, are huge. And therefore, one last point, which is that in the UN, we and our allies throughout civil society in North and South alike recognize that, in a sense, our power to change that is not the project dollar we give. No number of schools that we support or health clinics that we start will alone reverse this extraordinary crisis in the political economy that we face. It will come from our power of advocacy to realign politics in North and South alike behind addressing this crisis. And there, I think, I began by saying that I think US mines were tragically opened in the tragic circumstances of September. But equally in the South they must be opened. And we have embarked on this Millennium Development Goal campaign, which are 8 goals to change the world: to halve poverty, to get all kids into school, to reverse major diseases such as HIV/AIDS, to establish a sustainable environment policy across the world. And we're beginning to track them country by country with the rather grand ambition of mainstreaming them into the political debate, from Tanzania to the United States to Kazakhstan. That everywhere politicians will be judged, public policy will be judged by our progress towards rectifying this crisis in the global political economy. And we saw it happen in 20th century Europe and the United States, as politics turned from being about faction and interest and personality to which party and which platform could really address the social ills of our societies. We have to create that same conversion in the politics of the South, and we have to support it by bringing back onto the agenda in the politics of the North our contribution to solving this crisis, which affects all of us and all of our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Malloch Brown. We will now hear from Dr. Gordon Conway of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to concentrate on this larger issue of the war against poverty. I want to start by dispelling a couple of misconceptions. First, as you can tell by my accent, I'm a New Yorker. You may all believe you're diverse over here in California, but I have to point out that 40% of us New Yorkers were not born in the United States. The second point is that the Rockefeller Foundation is nearly 90 years old and is sometimes viewed as a fuddy-duddy East Coast foundation. Just to partly dispel that myth, we have opened a San Francisco office, and Julia Lopez, our vice president, is in charge of that office. I think she's somewhere here in the audience. Out of that office, we're running our venture philanthropy work. We're working with the California Endowment on Health and Employment in California, and we're about to embark on a major program on transnational communities between Mexico and the West Coast. On September the 11th, Julia Lopez and I and all the other senior staff of the foundation and the trustees of the foundation were coming back from Italy from a board meeting. So we were courteously escorted to Gander in Newfoundland and spent 3 days sleeping on the pews of a Pentecostal church, which did me a great deal of good. Fortunately, Pentecostals like soft pews. Or at any rate, the ones in Canada do. When I finally got back, I said, okay, let's put in $2.5 million as an immediate response to September 11th. And what I said was, all of the staff should get together, not just the program staff, but the staff who are support staff, the account staff, the computer staff, and so on, and come up with a plan to spend that money, and I gave them 24 hours. And it was very interesting what they came up with. They, first of all, said what we must concentrate on are the low paid. Those families that have either lost people or have lost jobs, particularly immigrants and particularly illegal immigrants. And so that's where a great chunk of money went. And they said we must also provide money to those who are suffering from the backlash. So we gave money to South Asian groups and to Arab groups and to Muslim groups, helping them, for example, to safely bus their kids to school. It was interesting what they came up with, because I think it was a reflection of what we've been trying to do in the foundation. The first couple of years at the foundation, I spent a lot of time with the staff trying to enunciate our values. And we came up with 5 values. First of all, equity and fairness. Secondly, diversity. Thirdly, knowledge and creativity. Fourthly, voice and participation. And finally, humility. Of course, I have to say this last one that we have real problems with. And out of that came a new mission statement. We said that now we say that we are a knowledge-based global foundation with a commitment to enrich and sustain the lives and livelihoods of the poor and excluded throughout the world. So we're saying the bottom line of every grant we make is, will it help the poor and excluded throughout the world? And in many ways, it was that mission statement and the enunciation of values that colored the way we responded to September 11th. It was also, of course, a function of the fact that we are a global foundation. We've been so since 1913, when we were created, working, for example, on hookworm eradication, setting up the Peking Medical College in the 1920s, working on yellow fever vaccine, and then the Green Revolution after the war. Over 70% of our money goes to programs outside the United States. And central to what we're doing, and to what I think all of us are doing, is tackling this issue of globalization. I like to think of globalization as personified, or actually the right word is deified, as the Greek god Janus, the two-headed god, the god with a dark head, which is where all the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the fair side to this twin head, which is where everybody benefits. There is, as Marx said, enormous inequity in this world. I think the most obscene inequity is the birth of infants with HIV. We've been sat here for about an hour. In that time, 200 women have been infected with HIV and 60 babies have been born with HIV. But in the United States, it's only 200 a year. In Africa, which is twice the size of the population of this country, it's 600,000. And it's obscene because we know what to do. We know how to prevent that transmission of HIV from mothers to infants. I'm not arguing that poverty breeds terrorism, but we do know that it provides justification. It provides a sense of legitimacy to those who wish to be terrorists. Who the poor and excluded are is not difficult to determine. They're mostly in the developing countries. The statistics are well known. 800 million people who are chronically undernourished, 180 million children who are underweight for their age, 40 million people in the world who are infected by HIV/AIDS, and many millions infected by TB. We've chosen, as part of our work, to concentrate on that, and in particular we've chosen to concentrate on those aspects where there is a deficiency, where government and the private sector are simply not doing enough. And by government, I mean government in this country, government in the developing countries, and the private sector generally. A very good example, of course, is in food. The big biotech companies are not working on the food crops of the poor. They're not working on millets and so on and so forth. One thing that we've done in association with the UNDP and the Japanese government is to fund a brilliant group of African scientists who have crossed an African rice with an Asian rice, and these new varieties are now spreading over thousands of acres of West Africa. West Africa, which at the moment imports rice to the tune of $1 billion a year. It's the same with pharmaceuticals. A classic example that we're working with at the moment is microbicides. Microbicides are compounds that women can use as gels or foams to prevent them from catching HIV/AIDS, from getting the virus or other STD. Not a single large pharmaceutical company is working on this. Not one. They're all small, struggling biotech and other companies that are trying to produce this drug. It's true also of vaccines against HIV/AIDS. There's work on vaccines to tackle the HIV strains in the industrialized world, but not for Africa. And that's why we created the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which is also supported by the Gates Foundation, and where we've got the leading vaccine now being used in Nairobi for safety trials and about to go into third phase. The most recent of our initiatives is something called MTCT+. As I mentioned, infants gain the virus from their mothers at childbirth. We're doing a lot now to prevent infants gaining that. But of course, if you save the infant, you've still done nothing for the mother. In many ways, all you've done is to create another orphan. And so we've started a program in Africa of treating mothers, treating adults. It's the first time that this will be done on a large scale. And we've raised about $60 million for this, and there are people in the room who are part of this partnership with us, the Packard Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, and United Nations Foundation. And I'm rather hoping that I think there's a couple more foundations in this room who I hope will come on board to raise the full 100 million that we need. That, in a sense, is a kind of out front of the larger Global Health Fund under the leadership of the Secretary General Kofi Annan. It's a piece of operations research, if you like, trying to show how you can, in African circumstances, provide the full treatment that's required for people with AIDS. Much of what we're doing and much of what needs to be done are what might be called public-private partnerships. We are, for example, trying to set up entities whereby biotech companies and pharmaceuticals donate their intellectual property for African scientists. I want to finish with an image. It's a very simple image. It's the image of the three-legged stool, the traditional milking stool, if you like. I believe that modern societies, whether they are in the developing countries or here, are like three-legged stools. They have three legs: the government, the private sector, and the NGO sector. And in some sense, for success, they have to be equally weighted. And I think the big challenge for philanthropy, apart, of course, from funding the NGO sector, which is very important to do, is to help to create the binding that brings those three sectors together. I think the biggest challenge we face, and I believe that there are many in this room who are very good at this, is to try and cut deals. To cut deals between government and the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. I think if we can do that, it's a strategy for combating poverty in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are going to have people with roving microphones move around. There they are. If you start moving around the room as people raise their hands, the lighting is actually such that I can't really see them. So you're going to have to, because of that, I'm going to take my seat again and then call on them and ask people. There are a few ground rules here. The first is that you need not disguise a comment as a question. We are eager to hear your answers as well as your questions, so feel free to make comments, share your own experience. The second is, please turn off cell phones and beepers. This is being recorded for NPR, and they are not pleased by cell phones and beepers. I will now just open, we have a question over here, so go ahead and I will move back. Please, and direct your question to the panelists you'd like to.
This is for Mr. Conway. Toward the end, you talked about a strategy to combat poverty in the world, and you gave several examples in terms of AIDS, microbicides, and AIDS vaccines. And you also spoke about collaboration with three legs of a stool. How does your organization and those you collaborate assess in an objective and quantitative and valid way a hierarchy of strategies in terms of their demonstrated success in pilot projects so that you know that your money is going to the right projects on a long-term basis?
Should people identify themselves? Sure. Could you?
Sure. I'm Jerry Sarnett. I'm a physician and the chair of the local homeless organization.
I think the strategy is relatively straightforward. I mean, it does consist of certain pilot projects. For example, this MTCT Plus that we're doing will start off with about half a dozen sites in sub-Saharan Africa. There'll mostly be sites where there's already treatment of mothers to prevent the transmission to the infants. We will then work on expanding that to a larger segment of care providers. I mean, the object being really to demonstrate this is how to do it. Now, when we've got to that point, then I think the governments themselves will want to take this over, or we will hope they will want to take it over. And they may then want to go, for example, to the Global Health Fund to get more funds to continue it on a larger scale. I mean, I think it's a stepping process from small to large. The trick, of course, is to find the right place to do it in the first instance. And it often means that you don't actually work in the poorest of the poor areas. You actually work in some areas which are poor but have got certain degrees of support for what you want to do. I think that's the biggest trick in the process.
Let me identify myself first. I'm Zani. I'm a Burmese political exile, 14 years in this country. I wear two different hats. Advocate for human rights movement in support of Aung San Suu Kyi inside Burma, and I also direct a capacity building project addressing long-term needs of Burma's reconstruction. Mine is not a question, it's a comment. Since the panel set the tone and laid out the parameters of this discussion, I want to inject in one comment, which is usually in philanthropic world, correct me if I'm wrong, people see their act as giving their most precious items, dollars, to the less privileged, the downtrodden. And I like to rephrase it, because people like myself and my colleagues in other parts of the world who are involved in long-term structural social change, we're basically using the most precious item we have, which is our families, our lives. And so like from my perspective, it is not philanthropists and foundations giving us help. We would like to for you to see it as an act of solidarity. People who are laying down their lives and people who are sharing, less valuable resources. And nothing is more valuable than human lives. And so it's actually a way to rethink giving. So that would truly pave the way for strategic partnership, and then addresses the issue of here they are giving us money, and down here we are begging for money. And so it's really a comment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of the conference will be devoted to the discussion of strategic partnerships, and that is very much the spirit of this undertaking. Go ahead.
Building on that, and I certainly appreciate that comment. Oh, my name is Jane Yett. I'm from Santa Cruz, California. I would like to ask Kavita Ramdas what she means by our ability to give grants to some of the most exciting social movements in the world. How do you give a grant to a social movement?
Thank you.
Certainly with the comments of the former questioner in mind.
Yes, and I think that, thank you, Jeannie. I think that that's exactly to the point of the former comment. To my way of thinking, as I said earlier, philanthropy is not an exercise of charity. And philanthropy is not about somebody sitting up here and giving to, as you very accurately put it, somebody down there. I think in our experience with funding social change, with supporting social change, without being so cliched as to use the term partnership, because I think there is actually a very big difference. Those who are putting their lives on the line every day in ways that you talked about are not taking the same kinds of risks that we are by choosing to support those actions with a small grant or a large grant. So I think there is something that we need to be careful about when we use the word partnership. But I do think that there is an opportunity to support those kinds of social movements by engaging with a very different level at which people can make change. And that is actually starting from a premise of trust and respect for the people who are actually on the ground doing the work. And I think that's extremely hard. My colleague Gordon mentioned how difficult the last of those 5 values were, humility. And I think humility in the practice of philanthropy, which after all means love of humankind, is an extraordinarily difficult practice for each of us because it confers upon you the sort of power and the position that the earlier speaker referred to. And I think that is exactly what needs to be transformed. It is what is being transformed. I think the women's funding movement is an extraordinary example of that. When you have a women's fund in Nepal that is over 60% supported by Nepali donors, you change the dynamics of some of the power relationships that exist between giving and receiving. And if we, as foundations and as government aid and bilateral aid organizations, can begin to inject a little bit more humility into our actions, I think we have an opportunity to truly learn from those who are on the ground.
Can I just follow up and ask a very quick question? Because as Mark Malloch Brown talked about rebuilding Afghanistan and the challenges that exist there, I kept wondering what the role of small grants would be in building civil society.
Well, let me just say, Jane, I think I use the chance also to reinforce the humility point, because what is very striking in Afghanistan is that Afghans feel they've had their politics done unto them by outsiders for several decades, and there is an admirably prickly sense of we want to do it ourselves, and a deep suspicion of outsiders, despite the very fully acknowledged and appreciated role that the coalition played in giving Afghanistan this new chance. Having got it, Afghans want to do it for themselves. And, I think that obviously Gordon's three legs in Afghanistan are very underdeveloped. You've got no government, as I described it. Civil society was highly atomized and fragmented by the years of persecution and needs to be rebuilt. And you've got no private sector except a corrupt trucking industry, which is trucking guns and narcotics. So you're dealing with very difficult terrain. But in it, you've got those women I talked about who are starting to form groups. You've got distant communities isolated by the geography of the country, which is so critical, mountains with a community per valley in the mountains. And therefore, for vehicles like microcredit, different community development activities, there is a huge opportunity, but tremendous difficulty in design and delivery. And I think, a lot of foundations will break their teeth on this, but it's really good work if you have the courage to undertake it.
And on the issue of it being small grants, I think, Mark, that's an important point as well, because I think as we begin to think about the reconstruction of this particular country, but also I want to remind us that you mentioned this is true for many other countries, I think this can happen at a variety of different levels. I mean, you can make a $3,000, $4,000 grant to a group of women who are trying to reconstruct a school or run an after-school program for girls, and that doesn't mean that you also don't need the kind of support that is necessary to rebuild a road or to build, an infrastructure to support civil servants' pay. And I think that that's an opportunity for us in this room together, if we can pay more attention to the people who are on the ground, to listen to actually what their needs are. It doesn't always take a $150,000 grant, but it takes the willingness to be able to engage, to find out what kinds of small grant support can actually make a difference, and to be willing to listen to people who are on the ground.
Gordon Conway, I'm going to give you a shot here because you are heading up a foundation that has as part of it, as its explicit mission, humility and the ability to listen to folks on the ground.
Well, I think most of the things have been said. I just want to say that something that's been happening, really something of a revolution in the last 15 years among development experts, if you like, is the creation of tools which allow much better communication between the expert, whether it be an outsider or somebody within the country, an agricultural extension worker or a physician. Communication with poor people. And many of these are extraordinarily powerful, and they turn out to be very, very simple. Techniques of mapping, for example. You can go into a village as an outsider, an Indian village, say, and give people colored chalk and powder and say, would you like to map your village? And you come back about an hour later and they produce an incredible map of that village. I remember one map where they'd gone and got soil from each of the fields and made the map out of it. And when we got back there, they started to talk about their village in ways they'd never done before. They said, look, you can see we need a well here. We need something here. This is our big problem. The soil's over here. What can we do? That had never happened before. What had normally happened was that they sat there being humble, listening to the expert, telling them what to do. And that really is now a technique that's being used, and there's lots of other examples of it, I haven't got time to talk about them, by NGOs, by governments, by extension workers, by physicians, to get a much better communication. And it does, apart from anything else, it helps development experts be a bit more humble.
Yes, sir.
My name is Nathan Gray. I'm the founder of international youth training organization called Earth Train, and I spent the better part of January in Pakistan, mostly in the northwest frontier province, where unlike what we're seeing in Kabul, you don't see women throwing off the veil. Far from it. In fact, in the streets of Peshawar, you barely saw women at all. And I spent a good part of that time with the leaders of NGOs, Pakistani NGOs, some of them very grassroots. And they expressed a concern, and that is that so many funders, to the extent there are NGOs even receiving funder attention, since so much energy is going to Kabul, but funders are looking for programs to help girls and women. And the concern they articulated is, look, in our part of the world, you fly that banner and you have trouble. I was struck by what Mr. Brown said regarding one of the levers, youth, a suggestion that came out of the dialogue. Would sure be great if funders could look at ways to support youth, and inside of that envelope, really pay special attention to issues of girls, young women. That sure would be great, but I don't see any willingness to do that. My trip was funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and I'm kind of intrigued by how little one hears that kind of discussion back here in funder circles. Thank you.
Well, you know, I think you're going to hear in the next session from my colleague, Thoraya Obaid, who is, well, she doesn't need any introduction from me, but as the top Muslim woman in the UN, she constantly cautions me to be very careful about how to frame this women's issue when it comes to this region. And, you know, I think what you say is absolutely right, and it's why I stress the point about the conservatism in the countryside, which is as true of northwest Pakistan as it is of rural Afghanistan. On the one hand, we can't wear our strategy on the sleeve of empowering women in societies where, you know, that is to have doors slammed shut in your face. There's got to be a cultural sensitivity and an understanding of where these societies are coming from in terms of addressing this issue. But, for you as philanthropists, or for me as head of the UN Development Programme, right at the heart of our mission is a vision of a society where men and women enjoy equal rights. So I think we can be tactically clever about this, but mustn't compromise on the fundamental issue of our objective, which is to secure women and girls access to education and full rights in the society. And when you're not tactically clever, I mean, just to draw out a little bit further what I said implied in the beginning, you can get into real trouble. I mean, the not much lamented Soviet period in Afghanistan was characterized by an effort to secularize, including promoting the rights of women. And it was one of the issues which secured the most popular resistance in the country. So, you know, this has got to be dealt with subtlety and social understanding and appropriateness.
Could I add that I think that the way in which that could happen is actually if we did pay more attention listening to people in their own communities about what works in their own communities. In women's organizations around the world, whether it's Uganda or Zimbabwe or Uzbekistan or Afghanistan, women are the ones who are figuring out what are the tactics that work in their communities. And so I don't really think it's up to us to figure out, what we need to do or what we don't need to do. I think if we spent more time actually talking both to men and women in their communities, and Dr. Yunus learned this in his work with the Grameen Bank, I think, again, it sort of comes around to not sort of making our strategies sitting up here, but beginning from a different place, beginning from a place of listening.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm David Bank. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. And I've been tracking the discussion around the increases in foreign development assistance that are coming up. And I guess I want to ask the big question, to just sort of lay it out here, which is most of the countries of the world have agreed on the goal of having poverty, extreme poverty, by 2015. There seems to be a sort of price tag that seems to be agreed upon, which seems to be about $50 billion a year. And then you get into discussions how to get to that sum, obviously. But the other question is, what would you do with the money? Is there the capacity there in governments, in NGOs, in other organizations to spend that effectively? So let me just put it out to you. If you guys had $50 billion a year to have poverty in the next 13 years, how would you spend it?
Okay, I'll take the $50 billion. Mark will talk a little bit about the goals. There are problems about the goals. I mean, we know, for example, that there will be considerable decreases in poverty in China over the next 15 years, and that will greatly affect the global statistics. The same, I think, is going to be true in India. India is on a path towards great reductions in poverty. And so, in part, it depends upon, and this is the difficulty, what you're talking about. If you're talking about China, China can certainly absorb large sums of money. It has a great deal of the policies in place and the institutions to make use of it, and I think India can too. Afghanistan, clearly, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. The real challenge comes, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa. You've got a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa which are doing well. Uganda is a very good example, just to pick one of them, where you've got real progress, a reasonably good civil society, and that can absorb more aid money. But I think in other parts of Africa, it's going to be very difficult, simply because you don't have the basic governmental civil service. You've got to get a bit of a stool, a bit of a three-legged stool to work with in the first place. And I think it is, let me just say this point, philanthropy has an enormous role to